snow lay in soft hushes over the godswood. The weight of Winterfell's silence pressed into each white-laden bough. The pool was a dark eye, unblinking, and the weirwood's face peered down with its long, bleeding smile. Jon could feel the cold in his teeth when he drew breath. Ghost moved through the drifts without sound, pale upon pale, a flicker of red eyes in the white. Jon had not meant to come so early, but sleep had abandoned him young, and the thought of leaving had gnawed at his stomach like a rat trapped in a grain barrel. He turned when his father came. Lord Eddard Stark seldom disturbed the godswood at this hour. The gray in his beard caught the weak light, and in his face there was the kind of harsh tenderness that the snows taught men, how to stand without flinching and how to keep warmth banked deep. He stopped beside Jon with the familiarity of old habit, as if he had expected to find his son here by the heart tree and had not doubted it. "Jon," Lord Stark said quietly, "walk with me." They took the path circling the pool, their boots compressing the crusted snow. No raven called, no branch creaked. Even the breath of the weirwood's leaves seemed held. "Bran still sleeps," Jon said at last, because the silence grew too great for him. "No change." "None," Ned said. "The boy is strong. When he chooses to wake, he will." Jon wanted to say something more, of helplessness, of the way the castle had shifted under the king's tread, of Catelyn's cold mouth and Sansa's dreams and Arya's sharp, wary eyes. He wanted to tell this man who was father and not father that leaving Winterfell felt like peeling away a bit of his own skin. Instead he closed his mouth because there was no kindness in complaining, and because Lord Stark had a look now he had seen only once before, after the news from the south that his brother and father were dead. A look like a door closing, like a lock turning. Ned halted at the very edge of the pool. The red leaves made a thin whisper. He did not look at Jon. He looked into the water as if it knew how to give answers. "I have been an honest man all my life," he said. "That is what I have told myself. I served my liege lord, kept my word. I kept my house. I kept my children." He swallowed. "But there is a lie I kept, and it has frayed on me more than the cold ever has. I meant to carry it to my grave." Jon's mouth went dry. Ghost stood at his knee and looked up. Ned's eyes, when he raised them, were slow with pain. "You are not my bastard." For a moment the words were nothing but sound in the pale air. Then they took shape and stepped closer and put a hand on Jon's shoulder with a weight that bent him. "It was a war," Ned said. "Everything came apart. Oaths, houses, songs. The dead lay like felled trees across rivers, and the living built their bridges over them. I loved my sister. I failed to protect her when I was boy enough to think I could protect anyone." He drew breath deep like a man going under the ice. "She died. When she died, she made me promise her something. I gave her that promise and built my life around it." The weirwood watched as if it had known all this was coming. "Your mother," Ned said, and the name came out as though he had held it behind his teeth until it cut his tongue. "Your mother was Lyanna Stark." Jon had thought himself made of tough leather. He had thought there was no pierce left in words for him. For years he had lived in a house where the word bastard was both a blade and a wall. He had learned how to walk without flinching. Now something inside him tore and exhaled, and the cold that seeped into him was not Winterfell's cold. It was a hollowing, a wind whipping through an emptied bottle. "My father?" he heard himself say, like a boy prying at a door that would not open. Ned did not turn away. "Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen." The name struck like iron in the air. Jon tasted metal, as if he had bitten his tongue. Prince in songs. A name that had sent men to war and put pyres alight along all the roads of the realm. A name half the north would spit. He closed his eyes. The world narrowed to a thin red whisper, like the wind through leaves. "Why?" he asked when he could. "Because I made a promise," Ned said. "Because if Robert had known, he would have swung his hammer at you before you had drawn your first true breath. Because I chose what I could live with and what I could not." "The Queen," Jon said. He was aware of his voice as something too calm, too measured. He had grown used to speaking under a weight. "Does she know? Does anyone?" "No," Ned said. "No one but me, and one other, perhaps, if he still lives. Howland Reed was at my side at the end. Ned's gaze went to the heart tree and back. I should have told you long ago, but I kept waiting for a better moment. There are no better moments. There is only now, and now I am leaving the north. If something happens in the south to me, you must have the truth. Jon thought of Catelyn's eyes when they looked through him as if he were a draft slipping under a door. He thought of Robb's hand on his shoulder in the yard. He thought of Ghost finding him in the snow like a white shadow drawn by some old power that recognized him beyond his name. He was both heavier and lighter, as if a chain had been removed and in its place a different weight had settled. One he had to carry because there was no other. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Live," Ned said. "With honor if you can. Keep your vows. The Night's Watch is still an honorable place, and you have always wanted to make your own name. Make it then. Let this be a truth that sits slow and quiet. If the time for it to be told comes, you will know. If it never comes, you will still have been my son." Jon bowed his head. A part of him scrabbled for anger and could not find it. Another part, one he did not show any man, curled against the warmth in the words "my son," as if it had found a fire. "When do we leave?" he said. "Soon," Ned answered. "We speak no more of this. Not to anyone. Not to Catelyn. Not to Robb." He nodded because he had been told to do so all his life and because obedience was easier than breathing. But after his father left the Godswood, Jon did not move. He stood and watched the ripples calm on the pond until the weirwood's face was smooth and red and sure. Ghost pressed his head to Jon's leg. There was a shiver under Jon's skin like a wolf shaking snow off its back. He thought of Robb's laughter and Robb's temper and Robb's stubborn mouth. He thought of long winter nights when they had whispered under blankets like boys do, swearing silly brother oaths that meant everything at the time and too little later. He thought of Robb standing alone in a hall that would be too big for him if his father did not return. Jon left the Godswood and went to find his brother. He found Robb in the practice yard, stripped to his shirt, sweat cutting dark paths in the cold. Gray Wind stood at the edge of the yard with his head canted, ears pricked, watching each of Robb's movements as if they were a hunt together. Ser Rodrik watched too, his mustache gathering frost, his scarred hands clasped behind him. Theon was there with a grin cocked, taking his turn to bait and praise by turns. Robb saw Jon and something like relief flickered over his face. There and gone. He had always been easy to read. He pivoted, made one last quick exchange with a practice sword, and then tossed it to a squire. "Ho!" he said in that careless tone he used when he did not want anyone to know he was tired. "If Ghost is here, there must be snow in the barracks." "There's snow everywhere," Theon observed with a long-suffering sigh, and stretched with a cat's lazy arrogance. "The gods help us if real winter ever comes. We will all freeze stiff as Mummer's puppets, and Catelyn Stark will have us arranged along the hall for decoration." Ser Rodrik made a sound like a cough, which for him passed as a rebuke. Robb grinned. When Theon wandered off with his careless swagger, Robb's grin went away like a lantern pinched. "Walk," Jon said. Robb always had something to say to the men, a hand to clap, a good word to give. Today he just nodded, wiped his face on his sleeve, and followed Jon past the old gallery, into the narrower passageways where the cold clung heavier, until they reached the rookery stairs where no one came if they could help it because the smells kept them away. The ravens muttered above like old gossips. Gray Wind came and went in the way of wolves, ghosting in their shadow with easy grace. Ghost's red eyes glowed. Jon kept his gaze on the stone steps. He felt the words like a thing too fragile and too dangerous, a jar of wildfire that would either explode or burn clean. He loved Robb, as a boy loves the boy who has stood at his shoulder all his life. He feared him a little too, not as a lord, but as a brother whose hate would break his heart if this went wrong. "I have to tell you something," Jon said. "All right," Robb said, because Robb was brave and foolish and trusting. Jon told him. He expected disbelief. He expected laughter or anger or horror, or that stubborn northern set to Robb's jaw that meant a fight, or a quick nod and a cold wall. He did not expect the silence that actually came. Robb stopped on the stair and reached for the wall like a boy who has been shoved and needs something to steady him. His face lost its color, which in him was saying something. He was always the warmer of the two of them, quicker to flush, quicker to grin. Grey Wind's ears flattened. There was a whine in Ghost's throat. "Gods," Robb said softly. Jon nodded because it was easier than trying to talk again. Does father know?" Robb asked, and then gave a small, helpless laugh at his own stupidity. "Of course he knows. He told me. And no one else?" "No." Robb drew breath and let it out hard. His hand on the wall made a slow fist and then opened. He looked at Jon as if trying to see the boy he had always seen and the boy now standing before him in the same skin. "You're my brother," he said at last. Jon stopped breathing long enough to ache. "I don't care what your father's name is." Robb went on, voice low and fierce. "I don't care if the South calls you dragon or wolf or both. You're my brother." Jon found the corner of his mouth trying to move. "The North won't say that," he said. "Not if they knew." "The North doesn't need to know," Robb said. "Not now." He swallowed. "Do you think Mother?" No, the word was heavy. "She can never know." Robb nodded. Pain moved across his face, troubling his mouth and his eyes, then went away, but it left something behind that had not been there before. A kind of resolution that Jon had seen only in Lord Eddard and in old men who knew what winter demanded. "We keep it," Robb said, "until there's a reason to do otherwise. I'll take it to my grave if I must. I swear it by the old gods." Jon wanted to say no oaths. Oaths were hooks, but he had been raised in a house where words were tools, and sometimes they were stones that built walls, and sometimes they were stones that sank men in rivers. He put his hand out. They knelt there in the cold, at the foot of a stair where no one lingered, and put their hands on the stone and swore as men have always sworn, the way boys do when they mean to be men, and the way men do when they wish they had stayed boys. Afterward, Jon felt oddly light. The fear of breaking Robb had been replaced by a new fear, but fear is a thing you can carry if you must. They walked back through Winterfell together. The castle was different for holding a secret between them. Walls seem to lean closer when there is a secret, hearths burn differently, and the path between two boys becomes a line that holds. The king's company clattered into the yard later that morning, bright banners flapping sleep out of windows. Jon watched from the shadow of a tower as Lord Stark met Baratheon with memory and duty and something like love, watched the queen's mouth become thin and sharp as a knife, watched Jaime Lannister's smile glint like gilded mail in the sun. Sansa's eyes were stars and daggers. Arya scowled and then grinned and then scowled again. Catelyn moved like a lady made of glass. Robb stood half a pace from their father and did not fidget. Jon stood and did not exist. He had always been good at that. At the feast, Theon laughed too loudly and slapped men on the back as if he had won them in a wager. Robb drank and kept his head and spoke to men whose banners he would one day need. Jon stood a length behind and watched and learned and tried not to think of the truth pressed against his ribs. When Arya stole a bit of pie and fed it to Nymeria under the table, Jon pretended not to notice. When the queen's eyes brushed him like a winter wind, he kept his own eyes on his cup. When the king rose to drag Lord Stark into old stories, Jon saw the weight in his father's shoulders and wished he could carry even a piece of it. In the days that followed, Winterfell became a place of partings. Ned would go south. Jon would go north. Robb would stay because someone had to keep Winterfell breathing. Catelyn would stay because she was stubborn and because Bran's bed called her. Sansa dreamed. Arya needed reminding to wash her face. Rickon clung to legs like a burr. Wolves wove through it all, the old gods' laughter in their breath. The night before they separated, Jon found Robb again in the Godswood. The snow had come down fine and hard, turning the air to a haze that softened the weirwood's cruel face. They said little. They had become men who kept their words under their tongues and let their silences do their work. "When you go south," Jon said at last, "listen to father. Hear the things he does not say." He smiled without humor. "You always have." Robb tilted his head, and snow collected in his hair. "And you," he said, When you go north, remember that the world is bigger than walls. You have a way of thinking you must carry the burdens you're given by yourself. You're one to talk, Jon said, and Robb laughed quietly. They embraced, and for a moment Jon could have believed they were still boys, and that everything coming would be like the snow. Cold and then soft and then gone beneath their boots when the sun thought better of its sting. They knew better, but they held the lie long enough to breathe. In the pale gray morning, Jon rode from Winterfell with Benjen Stark and other men whose faces were as hard as their mail, and Ghost trotted at his stirrup in silence. The wall lay ahead like a rumor made of ice. Jon did not look back until they were beyond the last copse where branch and trunk could hide a boy and his fear. He looked then and saw Winterfell's smoke columns, and for a moment he swore he saw a black shape on the ramparts that could have been a wolf or could have been a boy's shadow. He raised a hand that no one would see. The wind took it back. Robb stood on the battlements until the line of riders was nothing but a smear. Gray wind pressed close enough that Robb could feel the heat rolling off him. He imagined he could feel Ghost out there, pale heat in a different cold. He did not move. When Theon came and said something about practice or girls or both, Robb did not hear him. He watched the road be road and the snow be snow, and when he went inside Winterfell again, he was not quite the same boy who had walked out. Bran fell to the stone the night after the king left with his hunt. The castle moved in slow, stunned circles around the sick room. Robb went nowhere else if he could help it, but he still had to be Robb. He still had to stand at his father's side when men came into the hall with disputes that felt suddenly thin and far away. The Tully woman cut meat and fear into small pieces and swallowed them as if they were the same thing. Robb spoke when he had to. He learned to keep his face as still as stone even when he thought he would shatter it with the way his jaw clenched. When Jon came to take his leave, Catelyn flayed him with a gaze that was all bone. Robb had watched men bleed and had not felt as raw and angry and ashamed as he felt then on Jon's behalf. He followed Jon into the yard and put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because nothing would help. Ghost turned and looked at Robb, and Robb had the insane thought that the White Wolf understood everything, and forgave him anyway. Jon went north. Ned went south. Robb remained. The letters began. Ravens cut narrow lines through winter sky. Ink froze in Maester's pens, and the words moved like small iron weights from hand to hand. Jon wrote with reserve because the wall taught reserve. He wrote of cold that was not the North's cold but something older, of small kindnesses done among hard men, of the way Ghost ranged and returned, of Benjen's careful eye and Jeor Mormont's blunt words. He wrote one line once that made Robb stop and stand at the window with the paper in his hand, reading it over in the weak light until the ink might have been tears if Robb had been a boy who cried. "I still want to be a Stark," Jon had written. "It feels wrong to say when I know what I know, but it is true, not for the name, for the rest." Robb stood there and let that settle into him as if it were a song he had always known, sung softly in the background of all his days. He folded the paper and put it in a place where no one would find it. Then the raven came with his father's hand and not his father's words, and the hall exploded into cold noise. There was talk of Lannister daggers, of southern plots, of treachery. Catelyn burned all her gentleness to keep Bran warm and had none left for anything else. Robb sent letters. He sent for bannermen. He watched the great hall of Winterfell fill with men whose fathers had taught them to drink like bears and fight like wolves and follow Starks even into winter. The day Robb took his father's chair and felt it fit him ill, he thought of Jon in the cold. The chair was like the truth between them, heavy, old, necessary. The great Jon roared, drunk on anger and ale. Small Jon smiled with a mouth that knew everything and called nothing by its right name. Roose Bolton's eyes were lidded and smooth as a cat's, unreadable as ice. Rickard Karstark's grief stuck in his teeth like gristle. Galbart Glover had a wound in him that made him lean, even when he stood straight. They were men and lords, and Robb had to stand straight under all their eyes. "We ride south," he said, which was what they expected. "We bring father home." There was a deep exhalation from the hall, like a bellows used hard. Men lifted cups and swords and voices. Robb lifted a hand and the sound dipped. "We will not be wolves that chase a stag onto the queen's spears," he said. "We will be winter. We will be careful. The neck is ours. The rivers favor those who know them. We will not fight like the South expects." He hadn't meant to say so much. But something inside him had shifted when he learned the truth. Some stone moved from one arch to another so the bridge could bear more weight. He could sense danger under smooth words now. He could taste plots in the air, tinny and thin. He could also sense how easily a boy could be carried away on his own cry. Afterward, when the hall emptied to a hum and the dogs slept with their bellies full of bones, Robb found Catelyn sitting at Bran's bedside with a stare like ash. "I will bring him home," Robb said. He kept his voice gentle. Catelyn did not look at him. "You will bring him home." "Mother," he said. That word had always been too small for what she was. And how it felt both too big and too thin. "I need you to speak to Lord 𝒊𝒊𝒒 for me." Catelyn blinked. She looked at him at last with surprise and, "What?" Respect, perhaps watering long anger. "You are your father's son when you speak like that." "I am your son too," he said, and that, oddly, made her mouth soften. "We will cross the twins," Catelyn said after a moment. "But do not go to Lord 𝒊𝒒 asking to borrow his bridge. Go to give him something he can wear in front of his mirror and feel himself a great man. He has been looked down on all his life by Starks most of all. He will want to feel tall." "I'll give him hostages," Robb said, "and oaths, and any bracelets left in the house." He sighed. "Not sisters." A corner of Catelyn's mouth moved. "Not sisters," she agreed, and then her eyes returned to Bran. "Bring him home," she repeated almost to herself. "Whatever it takes." Robb left the sick room with a feeling like hands at his back. The north moved around him with the heavy grace of old wheels rolling. Theon rode out and back with messages and swagger, and Robb made sure every letter was polite and precise and gave no man's pride an excuse to prick. The Blackfish came with river words sharpened, and Robb learned how to understand men who lived by water, how their patience was like the patience of a river, seeming still unless it is cutting away at the land under your feet. Lewin went through the ravens like a careful accountant counting coins that must pay for a war. Robb considered sending Theon to Pike and felt that old new weight push back at the idea. He thought of Jon's truth and of protecting it, and he thought of the Greyjoys the way men in the north did, as a storm that blows in without warning and breaks ships across your rocks. He sent 𝒉𝒆 𝒁𝒁 instead to carry poor honeyed words to the Salt Cliff and Old Wyke. Lady 𝒉𝒆's reply came back in 3 words. "They laughed, Robb." It was Catelyn who put her hand over his and squeezed. "We didn't need them," she said, "and you didn't give away Theon." The war's first clean truth came at the Whispering Wood. By then Robb had crossed the twins on terms that bound even 𝒊𝒊𝒒. Catelyn had spoken. She had made Lord 𝒊𝒒 feel as tall as his skinny legs would allow, dressed him in a promise that Robb had no intention of breaking. If vows were a sword, Robb meant to keep his edge. At the wood, the whispering was real. Leaves hissed. Men breathed through their teeth. The horses were ghosts under their riders. Robb's heart thudded in a steady measured beat he had learned in Winterfell's practice yard, a rhythm he could hold even with death close and clever. Grey Wind was a shadow white with teeth. Robb's plan was not grand. It was exact. It was a boy who had grown to a man while his father's men taught him to count spears and trust strangers as little as he trusted promises. He cut Jaime Lannister's chain of command the way a careful hand removes a jewel from its setting without cracking the stone. He moved men like pieces, and no piece was too small. He let the river do some of the work. He let patience do the rest. When it broke, when the hush burst into yells and iron and blood and the stink of men dying slow and fast, Robb stayed in the saddle and kept his eyes on what he had said he would do. He did not chase Jaime when the Kingslayer rode like a song toward glory. He cut the song to silence with a net woven of men and wolves and trees. Grey Wind knocked a golden knight from the saddle and took his throat while Robb's rider brought a hammer down on another's helm. Robb ordered men to tighten where a knot slipped and let men run where pursuit would be a waste. He did not kill more than was required. He killed enough. In the end, Jaime Lannister looked up at a sky suddenly empty of his stars and found a boy's face looking down on him. The boy's hair stuck to his forehead with sweat. The boy's mouth set with something like sorrow. Robb took him and did not speak until Jaime's sword had been stepped on and kicked away, and he had been bound as neatly as any bundle of twigs. "You are Lord Eddard Stark's son," Jaime managed with blood on his lip and mockery when he could find it. "They say he is honorable. They say many things," Robb said. "We will see what is true." There were men who called for Jaime's head that night, men drunk on victory and on hate. Karstark's grief showed its teeth. Bolton's softness was slick as eels. Catelyn's eyes were clear and beyond sadness. "Not yet," she said when Robb looked at her. "Not yet." Edmure was freed. The Tully banners burned and then were raised. The River Lords came long-faced and short-tempered to a Stark boy's fires with their troubles and their pride. And Robb listened because the North had taught him to. He learned to say no without scarring men too much. He learned to use Bolton's hunger and Karstark's rage and the phrase pinched vanity against their enemies and rarely against each other. He learned whom to trust with night raids and whom to keep close to his fire where mischief might die for lack of air. Then word came like a black blade. In King's Landing, far off, behind 1,000 knives and 100 masks, Lord Eddard Stark lost his head. The world tilted. For a moment the tents seemed to sway on their ropes and the riverbank to slip underfoot. The men who had given him their banners made a sound that was almost animal. Robb stared down at his hands as if they had betrayed him. He went alone to where the trees stood with indifferent patience, and a boy who had suddenly become something very much else knelt in the leaves and pressed his fists into the earth and wept without sound because the ground would take his tears and not use them against him. Grey Wind lay with his head on Robb's knees and did not move. In the camp, voices rose. "King in the North," said the great Jon. His words like a boulder thrown into a pond, splashing and spreading, drowning all other sounds. Others shouted it, uncertain at first, then with the heat of men who need something to burn. "King in the North." Robb stood and wiped his face and went back into the lights. They crowded him with their grief and their hope, each a hook. Catelyn looked at him, and he saw a woman who would have burned all the South to get her husband back and was left with ash. "Do you want this?" she asked him quietly when they were alone at last and the candles had burned low. "No," Robb said with something like a smile that was no smile at all. "I want to fish with Father in the Wolfswood when the first thaw cuts the ice. I want to wrestle with Theon and let him laugh and make a fool of me. I want to watch Jon try to be solemn and fail when Arya trips me in the yard. I want my little brother to wake up and complain that the bread is stale. I want all that." He looked at her with eyes that had dried of weeping because there were no tears left to wake. "But I will take what is given and do what I can do. If they make me king, then I will keep this realm from tearing so far it cannot be mended. I will keep the North safe. I will remember that winter is coming and the South is a place that forgets that." Catelyn's mouth pressed thin and then softened, and she nodded once, for herself as much as for him. Robb let them put a crown on him. It was not the giant iron thing of southern kings. It was a circle of bronze and iron and blackened steel shaped like points of winter branches. It was too heavy. He wore it because his father would have. That night he wrote a letter and he wrote it twice. The first version was too blunt and too bright. He burned it. The second he wrote with his anger banked. He wrote to the wall and used no words that would demand an answer or a vow. He told Jon what had happened, and then he wrote the only thing he could write and still be Robb. "Brother," he wrote, "not the name they gave you, not the name they gave me. The one we gave each other." He told Jon that he loved him and that he was king now and that both were true and both were strange. He told him he would send men to the Neck and to Moat Cailin and to the Dreadfort and to the White Knife, because winter taught you not to let your flanks freeze. He told him he would not send Theon to Pike because you did not send hostages to their fathers when you needed the Father's hands tied. He told him he had taken Jaime but would not kill him. He told Jon nothing else and everything else besides. When Jon read the letter under the harsh light of Castle Black, where torches made the ice throw back a strangely soft light, The words seemed like the voice he had known at his shoulder through battles made of snowball and the old men's stories in the hall. He closed his eyes for a moment and saw Winterfell's towers fat with snow. He had thought he had been forging himself into a man of the watch. He had thought he had left boyhood behind at the milepost where the road to the wall turns north. The letter showed him that boyhood came with you whether you willed it or not, tucked in your pack, whispering, warming your hands and making you weak, both at once. 𝒎𝒊𝒏𝒈 had learned by then how to walk the yard without falling every third step. He read the letter when Jon passed it to him and made a sound like grief catching its breath. "Oh, Jon," he said. "I won't leave," Jon said for Sam's benefit and for his own. "I made my vow. I will keep it." "Of course," Sam said, and then he said, "Would you pass the sausage?" In a tone so precisely normal that Jon laughed despite himself. Ghost looked up as if he had been waiting for that. Jon's laugh drifted into the cold air and turned to something invisible you could still feel. The men at the wall do not laugh often enough. When they do, the sound sits in old cracks and works like a wedge to ease them a little wider so the place doesn't come down on your head. Benjen Stark did not return from the ranging. The wall kept being itself, endless, indifferent, old as judgment. Jeor Mormont called Jon to his table sometimes and spoke of duty not as a banner but as a blanket you wrapped around yourself when the wind cut and you had to sleep anyway. All around him, hard men and boys who had not had a chance to become men learned how to look at a cold horizon without blinking. Jon dreamed of snowfields and something moving slow and patient out there that did not breathe like men breathe. He did not say what he saw because the wall already had enough old men telling tales, and because dreams were a poor coin in the daylight. Ghost slept with his nose on Jon's boot and sometimes snapped his jaws in his sleep. In the south, Robb learned how to turn victories into habits rather than into songs. The riverlands burned, and he put out fires as he could. He wrote to White Harbor and to Bear Island and asked for ships and fish and spears and patience. Wyman Manderly sent him money in quantities that made men's eyes gleam. Robb sent him thanks in measured phrases that made nothing of it. Meej Mormont sent him blunt women with eyes like axes. Robb listened when they spoke and used them as he used men, without flinching. Roose Bolton was polite and helpful, an elegant knife sheathed in velvet. Robb learned that to use a knife you never put it somewhere you could not watch it. When Theon chafed and asked again to be sent to Pike, Robb thought of Jon and of the truth that had set a weight on his side of the scale. He told Theon no, gentle at first, then hard. Theon laughed, too loud. He swaggered and then stayed, and his eyes narrowed, and Robb saw the boy he had grown up with shrink into a shape that did not fit him anymore. There were ravens and more ravens. Arya gone in the city, Arya who had always been wind and knife. Sansa caged, pretty bird, pretty words. Rickon growing wild. Bran awake, gods be thanked, but changed, eyes old as the heart tree now and wild as summer storms. Catelyn went to her sons and returned to battlefields with grief in black bands around her words. Robb held his men together with a steadiness that surprised him. He wrote to Howland Reed. He wrote because he had a right and a need. Because a quiet man in the Neck had once stood beside his father at a place where red mountains cut the sky and watched truths fall out of a tower like stone. Because if there was one living man who could shape this secret rather than be shaped by it, it was the man from the marsh with a frog spear and a stubborn heart. The reply came in the form of a reed bound with a green twist of silk and a few lines so plain they might have been a huntsman's list of the day's kills. I will come if I can. If I cannot, you must come to me. The Neck moves. So do we. Your father's promise is the marrow in my bones. Keep your head low when the arrows fly. Signed only with a small drawing of a Crannogman square tower on legs. Robb looked at the reed-fettered letter under the lamplight and felt a steadiness in himself that he knew he had not earned and would try all his days to deserve. He held his crown in another's presence as little as he could. He ate simply and slept not enough. He won battles. He lost pieces of himself. One night, when the tents tattered and the wind sounded like wolves speaking a language men had forgotten, Robb took up his writing kit and did what he had been thinking of doing since the North had called him king. He wrote a will. If I die without trueborn issue, it began in a hand that had steadied itself by force, I name as my heir and the next lord of Winterfell my brother, Jon, presently sworn of the Night's Watch, whom I herewith declare to be Jon Stark, son of Eddard Stark, and—" He stopped there a long moment, breathing as if the air had grown too thick, "and whom I charge to guard the north and keep the pledge our fathers kept." He left off naming Jon's true father. That was not for paper. It was for men he could look in the eye. He sealed it with wax and a wolf's head impressed, and put it in a leather tube and gave it to a man he trusted more than he trusted his own hunger. "Go to White Harbor," he said. "Give this to Lord Manderly's own hand. Not to his man, not to his maester, to the Lord. Tell him that winter is no longer coming. Winter is here. Tell him to keep this as he would keep his own meat for his grandchildren. Tell him that if anyone else ever asks for it, they had better be me or a ghost with my voice." The man nodded, as men nod who have been given weight they will carry forever if they must. He rode away before dawn, into fog that ate sound whole. Jon's letter in reply came on a day when Robb had forgotten that good things still came on ravens' black wings. He took it in his tent and read it once and then again, the second time tasting each word like a piece of bread when you have been hungry too long. "I cannot accept what you ask. The watch has my vow. Without the wall and men to stand it, there will be no north to inherit." Robb made a noise, not angry, not sad, proud perhaps, something worse and better both. He read on, "But I can be what I am to you. And if the time comes when vows fail men and men must be more than what their oaths have made them, I will not fail you then. I have begun to understand that there are older things than the laws of kings, and colder things than the justice of lords. You should know that I think Father would have been proud of you at the Whispering Wood. They talk of it here. I tell them little and listen much. Tell Bran I dream of a three-eyed crow. He will know what to do with that better than I do. Tell Arya to hide the way she taught me to. She will know I smile when I write that. Tell Sansa nothing, only that I love her. Tell Rickon to feed his wolf. It will keep him fed in return. And you, remember the thing we swore on the stairs. Jon." Robb sat still with the letter in his lap for a long time. Then he folded it and put it with the other letter in a place no hand went but his. In the weeks that followed, the Ironborn came at last, but they found the neck barred with reeds and steel and Cranigman's tricks. They found Moat Cailin held by men who fought like neighbors watching their own houses burn, and they died in the ditches and the mud and the arrow-crowded causeways. Theon stood on the battlements of a watchtower and watched black sails catch a mean wind and go down in the mouth of the white knife like bits of sea-bent branch. He did not smile. He did not say anything to Robb about Pike. The words had burned out of him or turned to something else inside. Catelyn watched, and sometimes her hand found Robb's arm and squeezed, hard, as if to anchor him. She spoke to him in the night when sleep would not come. She spoke of her father and her sister and of girls who were princesses only in their snow-made keeps. And she spoke of Ned with a voice that scraped a little at the edges as if it were being used to polish bone. They went to the neck because Howland Reed had asked them to. They went because there are things you cannot ask of a man and still expect him to help you, and there are things you must do to deserve the help you need. They left the Freys glowering at crossroads, and the Boltons slipping and sliding their way toward victories that would not smell as clean as they might like. And they went into the green wet world where men in leather moved without sound and the ground gave beneath your boots if you put them down too hard. Grey wind snarled at nothing visible. That told Robb enough. He let the Cranigman's boats carry him as if he were a different kind of king entirely, a king of water that could carry you or keep you. He did not scoff at their frog spears or their reed-woven shields that looked like toys to men who had grown up with steel hung heavy everywhere. Howland Reed came to them out of a thin mist, a short man with hair like river grass and eyes that knew too much. He bowed the odd bow of his people and called Robb your grace, as if it were both a truth and a joke, and somehow both did not lessen it. "My father's friend," Robb said. Howland gave him a small smile that made him look older than he was. "Your father's brother," he said. At the end, when they were alone, when only reeds and water and the quiet coughs of frogs and the old god's patient waiting were their witnesses, Robb told Howland what he had been told and what he had kept. Howland listened without moving much, and when he moved, It was to reach into his small boat and bring out a bundle wrapped in oilskin and reed mat. Inside was a swath of blue as dark as night and a white cloth that caught the half-light like a snowfall. Robb touched neither. "You were there," Robb said. Not because he doubted, but because he needed to hear it said. "You saw." "I saw your father step past 3 good men and keep his promise to a girl who had made him someone different than war had made him," Howland said. His voice was quiet and had a softness that made Robb's mind fill in edges he did not provide. "I saw what men become when oaths are more real to them than their breath. I saw a boy born in a room that smelled of blood and flowers. I saw your father lie to a king he loved because the truth would have killed the only thing his sister had left him." Robb felt as though the water under the boat had turned to iron. "He told me," he said. "He told Jon." Howland's eyes moved as if they saw through tents and walls and stone and Southron courtyards. "Then it lives where it ought to, in the hands of men who bear it like a piece of iron that has not been worked and might still be forged into something worth holding." He put the bundle back in his boat and did not offer it again. "I will not say the names H. The neck knows how to swallow secrets and stones. Keeps both, but you do not throw them with careless hands. You will know when to throw, or not at all." "Not at all," Robb echoed. He thought of what Jon had written. He thought of the wall and of winter, real winter, not the polite taste of it the South liked to make songs about. He thought of where kings sit and where men die and how to put a body between those two that would last longer than one season. "Thank you," he said. The words felt useless. They were a beginning. "If I fall," Robb added, surprising himself, "I have made provision." Howland's mouth made a shape that might have been approval. "Good," he said simply. "Men who wait to do right things until they have time to do them usually die with right things undone." He dipped his oar and moved them through green water as if the world obligingly made a channel for him when he asked, "When the dead begin to move in the woods, write to me. Do not argue with your fear. Fear is older than kings." Back at the camp, Catelyn touched Robb's face as if counting the bones under the skin. "You look older," she said. "I am," Robb said. He thought of a tower in a red land and a girl he had never met and a boy he had always known and never wholly understood. "And not older enough. There are wars that end in fanfare. This was not one of those. Kept going. Bled men dry, fed men's habits and broke them. It sent ravens at midnight and dawn. It made invisible scars across the land that winter would protect and spring would make bloom and summer would make men forget." Robb kept winning small and losing small. He kept Frey vanity sated with ceremony and little command. He kept Bolton where he could see him. He kept Karstark's anger aimed outward. He kept Theon close. He kept Catelyn as safe as war allowed. Jon took his vows. He knelt in the snow and said the words that turned boys into stone towers and breath into walls. He felt the old gods listening in the branches of trees that had stood for 10 winters and 100 winters and that would lean over his bones when they were done with him. He spoke and did not look for a sign. Ghost stood with his nose to the wind as if he smelled something too far to be anything but a rumor. That night Jon slept and dreamed of a room too hot for Winterfell, where a girl smelled of crushed flowers and said a name he could not entirely hear. He dreamed of his father's hand around his and the feel of a linen band wet with blood. He woke with his throat tight and his mouth full of a taste like iron and sunshine. He did not tell Sam. He did not tell anyone. He went to the yard and learned how to loop rope with fingers too cold to feel, and he did not drop the coil even when his fingertips cracked and bled a little. He thought of the will he had refused, and he did not apologize to himself for refusing it. He thought of his brother with a crown too heavy, and he sharpened his sword. When Qhorin Halfhand came and looked at the wall like a man checking an old friend for signs of illness, Jon's chest tightened with a feeling like hope and dread spliced together. Qhorin said the words that made rangers straighten. He spoke of the Frostfangs and wildlings and of something older and worse. Jon listened because he had learned to listen in Winterfell and in the Watch both. When Mormont sent him, Jon tied up his cold fear and tucked it next to his letters. He left the wall with Ghost at his heels and the sense that the world was making him move along tracks cut into the snow long before he was born. He thought of his father. He thought of Robb. He thought, too, of the boy in the tower he had not been and yet had been all his life. South and north, and in the in-betweens where land does not know what to be, men made and unmade the world. Robb met with 𝒕𝒉 at Riverrun and learned that even men who love you will sometimes harm you because their pride asks for it. He forgave as far as he could and not farther. He sent Blackfish to ride where river meets river and make Lannister scouts regret their mother's patience. He sent Luwin letters to answer rumors with better rumors. Walder Frey sent daughters with eyes like needles and smiles like knives. Robb took their oaths and gave them gifts and did not give them his pride. He sent Jane Westerling a polite bow from across a crowded hall and then thought no more of her, because he had a list of things that mattered and this was not on it. When he bled, he did it in private, and he did not bandage with foolishness. There were nights when Robb felt so tired, he would have fallen asleep standing if not for Grey Wind nudging him from time to time with an annoyed huff. There were nights when he did not sleep at all because sleep would have been more danger than help. He had learned to count his breaths in a way that kept his head clear. He had learned to rub the crown's sore edges where they bit into him and then put his hand down and go on. On such a night, with the river saying old stories and new across black stones, Catelyn came to his tent and stood in the lamplight and kept her hands at her sides so he would see she meant to keep them there. "You are making yourself into iron," she said. "I am trying to keep us from shattering," Robb said. She took a breath. "I did not know you would be the one who could do it." "I didn't either," Robb said. "No one is until they are." She hesitated. "There is a thing I must say." He tensed a little. "Say it." "I have not been kind to Jon," Catelyn said. The words came like stones drawn out of a riverbed, heavy and slick with silt. "I have reasons. They look very thin now from where I stand. He did not make the world that hurt me. He simply stood in it." She blinked hard. "I may not see him again. I would like you to tell him." She stopped and raised her gaze to the tent pole as if the old gods were carved there. "Tell him that when I think of him now, I think of a boy who loved my girls and my boys and looked for my husband's step in the hall like a dog whose ears pricked at the right time. Tell him that I am sorry I worshipped at the wrong altar. Tell him I am still too proud to say more than that. Tell him. Tell him he was brave to go north and stay there." Robb let out his breath in a slow line. "I'll tell him," he said. She nodded once, fierce, grateful in a way that looked like anger, and left before the tent could hold what was in both of them. When Jon crept cold and smoke-stained through the frost fangs, when he lay with his cheek to the icy rock and watched men who were not exactly men move through the trees, when he trusted Qhorin and then did the thing Qhorin asked him to do because there are oaths made with breath and oaths made with blood and both are binding, when he looked into Ygritte's eyes and felt something in himself fall away like a crust of old ice, he kept the north in him like a coal he had banked too carefully to ever go out. "You know nothing, Jon Snow," she said often, which made him smile because it was sometimes true and sometimes not. He knew love the way boys do, first and devastating and mixed with guilt. He knew duty the way northern men do, cold and steady and heavy, and sometimes that steady weight becomes a rest rather than a burden if you learn how to shift it. He did not write to Robb in those days. There are times when words cannot travel. But he kept the letters he had in the place where his heart would remember them, and sometimes when he lay with his back to a rock and a fire too small to make a story of in his old life, he took the paper out and did not unfold it because he could see the words without seeing them. Back in the south, Robb's line of victories looked more like a stitched wound than a garland. He knew the phrase counted slights in units so small they required delicate scales. He did not give them more weights to put on. He knew Roose Bolton would slip a knife into anything that looked like a place he could slide it without the wound being traced back. He did not present his back to him if he could help it. There was talk of Stannis in the east, Red Witch in tow. There was talk of Renly in the south, playing at kings and then losing his head to a shadow. Robb watched the pieces move and understood two things. The south played games with lights and tapestries and little knives, and the true winter did not care for any of it. He put men into the Wolfswood and along the King's Road and on the barrows where wind cut deepest. He made sure the kitchens in Winterfell continued to put meat aside even when the fighting took too much and the weather took more. One late afternoon, when the sky had gone the color of hammered pewter and rain came in a slow, patient veil, a rider arrived from the wall, ice rimming the horse's tack. "From Lord Commander Mormont," the man said, and put a package in Robb's hands as if handing off a weight that had made him lean to one side for days. Robb opened it and read, backing into his tent to keep the rain from the ink. "Trouble in the mountains. I have sent men. My first ranger is missing. If your grace has southerners to fight, fight them. The wall still stands. When it does not, you will have no southern kings left to worry about. Keep your men warm. Keep their bellies full. It is easier to fight cold on a full stomach than hunger with a full fire." It was signed with Mormont's crabbed hand and a smear that might have been lampblack. Robb smiled despite himself. Then he looked at the last piece of paper in the package and the smile went away. 𝒎𝒊𝒏𝒈 had written in careful letters, as if making the letters themselves would keep the world from splitting where he saw it splitting. He wrote of dead things that did not bleed when they should and that rose after lying quiet where you left them. He wrote of cold that lay on you like a wet skin you could not peel off. He wrote of ravens refusing to fly certain ways, of old stories turning into not stories, which is to say realities. Robb folded Sam's letter slowly. The rain hissed at the tent like a crowd that wanted to be let in. He set Mormont's letter side by side with Sam's and then with Jon's last. He weighed them together. They were heavier as one. He cut his next set of orders accordingly. He sent Manderley more coin to turn into stores. He sent Karstark to the Green Fork because grief needed an enemy rather than a knife in its own gut. He sent Bolton to Harrenhal with careful instructions that would keep him busy without giving him fresh chances to double. He sent men north to the Barrowlands, ostensibly to hold roads but in truth to watch the skies. He wrote to Howland Reed again and did not expect an answer. He got none. War makes men old. Winter makes them honest. Between the two, Robb Stark found himself stripped of everything that was not needed. He missed it sometimes, that extra flesh that makes laughter easier and the nights less long. But when men came to him now in dark, he had more to give them than words. He had habits. He had patience. He had maps that had grown lines and smudges where fingers worried them like rosaries. He had people to send, and he sent them even when sending them hurt his chest. When word reached him of Catelyn letting the Kingslayer go in a midnight fit of mother's terror, the hurt in his chest became a blade. He did not scream. He did not smash anything. He did not take the crown off his head and throw it across the tent. He sat and breathed and put his hands flat and felt the way the earth still was there under the tent floor, implacable. Then he rose and told the men who needed telling and listened to the men who needed to speak and did not let his own grief become a flood that would carry them all off. He wrote to Jon and told him the truth without dressing it. He did not ask for comfort. He offered none. He kept the words clean as bone. Jon wrote back from a place high and white and older than their names. "We do what we must. Love makes us fools and then makes us strong. It is an old trick. The old gods must like it since they keep doing it. There are dead things walking. They fear fire. Men are worse when they are hungry. You were always better at keeping bellies full. I would give a finger to have you at the wall just now. No, not that. I would give all my fingers and a hand and then be of no use to you. So I will stay whole and you will feed men and we will both be worth more than if we let love make us idiots. Tell Mother I got her message. Tell her I knew. Tell her that when I think of her now, I think of the way she kept candles lit on long nights and that when she passed me in the hall her step never hurried even when everything inside her must have wanted to run. Tell her I am sorry that what she hated was not of my making but made me anyway. I am going north tomorrow. Do not write. I will not be able to answer. Keep your maps warm. The cold likes to eat them." He signed it in the way that hurt and healed Robb at once. "Your brother." Robb slept that night with Grey Wind's head on his boot. He dreamed of the Godswood and of the weirwood's carved face leaning too close. He dreamed of a room in a far place where a girl bled and smiled and cried at once and a boy's wail cut the air. He woke before dawn. He had a taste in his mouth like old metal and new snow. At dawn the men came for orders, and he gave them. They said later that if there had been a red wedding planned it died unborn in this world. starved for lack of slight and treachery, drowned in courtesies given timely, smothered by a lack of pretty girls to throw themselves under king's grief. They said the phrase sulked like old dogs kicked on a cold night but kept their teeth to themselves because Robb had not given them a foot to chew on. They said Roose Bolton was watched as carefully as a candle in a barn, and that if he tried to light the hay, he would have found the hay wet and the door locked. They said many things. The truth is that war and winter make rumor their meat. What is true is this: Robb kept his word to himself. He did not seek fresh glories. He did not decorate himself with foolishness. He tied up loose ends as if the world were a rope he meant to knot properly and leave to whoever would come after. He made ready to go north himself, because there is a line beyond which the north stops obeying letters and starts obeying faces. He wrote to Stannis and to men who wore other kings' names and told them carefully with small blunt words that winter had come and they would be wise to put out their hearths for strangers. A few laughed. A few did not answer. A few sent back words that tasted like iron and tasted like truth. Winterfell smoked again with meat for many, not just for few. Bran walked where he would, slowly, and when he could not walk he dreamed, and when he dreamed he wrote, which is a way of walking for those who must sit. Rickon grew feral and then less so. Sansa learned to make her voice into a blade when she needed it. Arya was the wind and the knife in it. Jon crossed ice and fire and came back again. Hair stiff with frost, cheeks raw with wind. He had seen things men call stories and learned they were merely facts too old to need new names. He had knelt to a false king and seized a true duty. He had chosen things only men choose and then borne consequences that boys could not lift. He had killed and then killed again, sometimes in battle with a shout and sometimes in dark with a breath caught in his chest like a fish that would not swallow the hook. He had looked at a girl he loved and made her his enemy because the world demanded it and because she demanded it. He had not broken his vow, though it had made him break his heart. At Castle Black, with the world's biggest ice stone at his back, Jon stood and let men call him oathbreaker and traitor and worse, and he did not cower because he had learned that shame is a thing that grows if you feed it with your eyes. He lived. He kept living. He learned to lead without the lie of thinking leadership made him better than the men he led. When the horn blew 3 times, and men looked into the white and saw shadows that should not move and did, Jon felt a steadiness in himself he had not expected. He sent ravens by the dozen. He sent one to Robb, empty of words except the only ones that mattered. Come north if you can. If you cannot, send fire. Robb received it in a world where there were no longer camps, only homes and specters, where men did not count victories in fields but in nights survived. He read Jon's few words and looked at the men around him and at his mother and at the wolves that moved like memories across the snow. He thought of the crown. He took it off and set it on the table and said, in a voice that carried through the canvas and into the river and over the snow and up the king's road to where men who loved to hear themselves talk fell silent because something bigger had spoken, "The North rides." And so they did. They rode not as a king's men or as lords seeking songs, but as winter's answer to a question the world had forgotten it had asked. They rode with spears that did not glitter because there was no sun to make them glitter. They rode with fires banked in iron boxes. They rode with hard bread and salted meat and women who could stitch a wound in riding and men who could set a bone in the dark and boys who would be men if they lived and old men who had nothing left but stubborn. They rode and the cold rode with them, old friend, old enemy. At the wall the world waited. It was not the place to write the end of songs. It was the place to push back against the beginning of a silence that would have swallowed songs whole. They came up the king's road in a line that made men on the wall straighten and then stand straighter. They came to Castle Black like the memory of every winter that had ever been, tightened into men who did not complain because complaining wastes breath you need. Robb's banner did not flap with its old pride. It hung heavy, as if weighed down by duty and ice. Grey Wind stood with Ghost and the other direwolves, and for a moment the old gods smiled in their red leaves, though there were no leaves here, in this cold that kept smiles as stones. Jon came down the steps, ice cracking under his boots, and the two of them stopped 2 paces apart because the world had made them both larger than the space between. They looked, and in that looking was everything they had been and everything they had become and everything they would need to be to keep the world from cracking. Robb went to his knees, Not as a man who bows to a king, but as a brother who returns something borrowed long ago. You kept your vow, Robb said. So did you, Jon said. That's not always the best way to win, Robb said, and smiled with a mouth that had learned to do so even when the world gave it little to work with. It's the best way to be able to live with winning, Jon said. They rose. They did not embrace. They did not need to. They stood and looked south and north and at the wall and at each other, and in the iron-chill air men saw something that made them stand a little taller in their rags, that made them grip their spears a little more surely, that made them breathe a little deeper despite the cold's fist. Later, by a fire that crackled like a living thing stubborn under the wind's blows, Robb took a piece of bread from his pack and broke it and handed half to Jon without comment. Jon ate. Ghost lay with his nose to Grey Wind's flank, as if remembering a litter long ago. Catelyn watched from a distance where her pride and her sorrow could both sit, and in her face there was something like peace for the first tea. 𝒔𝒕, since a boy had fallen from a tower and the world had said, now we will begin. Howland Reed slipped out of the shadows like something grown out of the world's wet places. He looked at the fire. He looked at the men around it. He looked at the wall as if it were a particularly stubborn piece of woven reed he intended to mend and keep for another season. There are old names we could speak, he said softly when they were alone enough. We will not. What matters will matter without them. What must be kept will be kept. Robb nodded. He had a will in White Harbor and maps in his head, and men who would die for him and men who would betray him if they thought they could live better afterward. He had a brother at his side who was and was not his brother. He had winter in his bones and a crown in a leather bag that would stay in that bag until spring or the end. Jon nodded. He had orders and doubts and dead things to kill and live men to keep alive. He had a brother who was and was not his king. He had two Fathers' names hidden in his ribcage where no sword could pry them out until the gods themselves asked. They slept when they could. They woke when they must. They stood on the wall and looked into the white and did not blink. When dawn came thin and scraping over the ice, the world did not change. The world does not often change for dawn. But men did. That is enough. Sometimes it must be. Robb looked at Jon. We'll hold, he said, and he meant it as a promise and as a prayer and as a threat to the world. Jon looked north. We'll hold, he agreed, and the wind carried their words along the ice and into the trees and over the barrows and across the neck and along the bed of the White Knife and down the King's Road. And stones and men both heard them and knew that for a while. In this place, in this time, in this winter, men's vows held as well as any magic. The world came on. They stood. They did not fall. And the secret between them burned clean and quiet, not a wildfire to make pyres of cities, but a banked coal to keep a family warm in a house where winter scratched at the door and was told, not today. Snow fell in thin, skirling veils that turned the air gray and soft, but the wall took no notice. It stood as it had stood, mile after mile of old blue ice that made men quiet without meaning to and made the loudest of them look small inside their furs. Robb walked the top with his cloak pulled close, breath a ghost before his face, listening while Jon named things that mattered. Where the pitch casks were stacked beneath the parapet under tarred skins, which hoist stuck when the wind blew too hard. How many turns on the windlass a boy with raw hands could bear before his fingers ceased being fingers and became pieces of wood that did not obey him. You know the place like a hound knows a scent, Robb said, after Jon called a halt and the guardsmen thudded their pikes back to the rest with gratitude they did not voice. Snow clung in a fine rhyme to Jon's lashes. Ghost stood with him, a white smear against the deeper white, his red eyes like little wounds in the weather. How long since you came up off the yard to look down instead of up? I came up the first time with Donal Noy to show me the winches, Jon said. I've been up too often since. There's a boy who keeps watch up here nights, kegs, thin lad, scrawny as a rake. Falls asleep on the fifth bell unless someone speaks to him every quarter hour. I keep two men paired to him who like telling tales. Robb smiled without showing teeth. You've turned their boredom into a weapon. Use whatever's to hand, Jon said, and see that it doesn't slip. A horn moaned then, one long, mournful blow from the south side that made the ice underfoot sing faintly. Robb felt the sound through his soles. Men looked at one another because one horn meant a returning patrol, but there were no patrols south in daylight while Mance Rayder's fires smoked beyond the trees. Jon had already moved, without haste, but with that hewn certainty that came to him in battle, like a door in him swung inward and revealed stone steps. He leaned over the crenel and looked to the near white where the king's road vanished. Ghost's ears pricked, and gray wind, far below near the gate, gave back a small, warning woof that rolled along the stones like a pebble starting a slide. "A rider," Jon said quietly. "Fast. Alone." The horn sounded again, 2 short blasts that wavered, as if the man at the bell had been jostled or was cold, or both. The gatemen below scrambled to their posts, and Robb felt the wall breathe, in and out, the way a quiet beast breathes when it hears something it knows may be a hunter. The rider came on at a lurching gallop that would have broken a worse horse. He slid from the saddle before the beast had quite stopped, making a tied bundle of himself in the snow, and the men had him up between them and through the tunnel into the dim, warmer dark. "From Mole's Town," he said when Jon crouched before him, calm as a man in a keep kitchen asking if the porridge is too thin. The boy's face beneath the crusted mask of frost was scarcely more than a man's. His lips blew around the words. "Wildlings in the shafts. The brothels burned. They have men with axes." Then, a tall man with scars and eyes like he's half asleep. They said, "Tell the crows to look south and not north, if they fancy their skin." "Steer of the thens," Jon said. He rose and did not look at Robb but spoke for him to hear. "He'll try the gate while our eyes are on the wildlings creeping at the base. We keep our heads. Noy holds the tunnel. I'll take the top. Your Grace." "You are at the wall," Robb said, keeping his voice steady because men listened for a tremor as dogs scent fear. "Use me, but do not break the watch for a king who forgot his place." Jon's mouth ticked, a very small smile. "Your place is to keep your men breathing. Pull your archers to the south face of the yard, there on the roof of the old armory. The wildlings will think the gate our only guard and come with ladders and ropes. We'll cut them where they climb." Robb nodded and went, the world narrowing to the list of things he could do in the quarter of an hour before the first grapnel bit into the snow at the wall's foot. He set Catelyn where she would do what she had left. Stand steady as a post and see that wounded men were carried to warmth and not left to freeze upright with their eyes open. He set Karstark men at the inner portcullis and the second gate, because grief would hold there better than any oaths presently thrumming in their veins, and what the tunnel needed was not zeal but refusal. He sent Small Jon to ride the line and tell the scattered northern captains in plain hard words that for once they were to obey the watch's little orders as if they had come from Robb's own mouth. "Bonfires along the south yard," he told the Manderly men, who looked too soft for this cold but were soft the way fat seals are soft, richly layered against knives and weather, pitch warmed to pouring. "Don't dally. When they come at once, and the first handful over will ruin us if they're let to their work." Gray wind pushed his head against Robb's thigh, impatient, understanding battle in that way of his that always made Robb feel he was the slow one in their pair. "Stay," Robb told him, and Gray wind actually stayed, though he hated it. Ghost had already gone with Jon, white on white. The first wildling to show himself at the wall's base was a fool with wolf furs over his shoulders and a bow that looked as if he'd stolen it from a boy's hunt. He loosed straight up in the manner of men who have never been to war at walls and watched their arrow fall back toward their own heads. The next had more sense. A then with a rope coiled precise as a snake in his hand. He cast and the iron hook bit into the thin crusted snow atop the wall's sheer face. 3 men rose on the line like beads on a string. "Wait," Robb told his archers, and the Manderly sergeant had the sense to shoot him a look and not argue aloud. "Let them climb." They all held their breath while the 3 came up, arms straining, breath smoking hard with the effort so that their bodies moved inside little clouds of their own making. When the first head peered over, eyes wide and skin white with cold, the sergeant grunted. "Now?" he asked, and Robb shook his head. They let the second man get his chest on the lip, the third his hand. "Now," Robb said, and a line of northern bows thrummed at once with the clean, quick sound of something that had been waiting years to do its work. The top man's head snapped back. The second flopped with a sound like a slain fish being dropped. The third lost his grip and went without a sound at all, only a long falling motion that made men at the bottom of the wall flatten themselves to the ice, as if that would make them less likely to be struck when he hit. More ropes flew. Grapnels found stone. The ladders began to rise. Long things of green would cut too hastily, still oozing sap. "Torches," Robb said. He had the pitch warmed and poured. The ladders set afire before men could commit too much to them. A barrel rolled off his rooftop and shattered, black splash leaping. And in the flame that leapt up with it, Robb saw a woman with a long red braid lifting a bough with an easy, unhurried motion. "Ygritte," Jon said later, as they went along the parapet together, watching men do the strange, orderly mess of fighting that is the same in every age. "Her arrows have swan fletching, white as they come. If you see white moving too fast, that will be her. She's with them still? I left her once," Jon said. "She'll return the courtesy." There was something in his voice that might have been pain and might have been pride, and was both in any case utterly under his hand. "No matter. Donal needs me." Noy stood in the tunnel with his bad arm and his hammer, with a half-dozen boys and men who had no business being first in any line and were the only ones he could spare. He had his sense of awe and heat as ever, measuring the chill with a stove-stoker's knowing. He'd barred the outermost gate and the middle, and the inner was all that would stand between them and a weight a mammoth might put its shoulder to. When the deep shudder went through the stone and the iron all together, men flinched and then caught themselves, ashamed. The second shudder made the candles falter. "It's a ram," Noy said, conversational. "Big as a cart with tusks. They'll push by mammoth. When they are ready to spend that much meat, they will." He touched the warped bar of the inner gate with his good hand, as if it were a child. "This will bubble when it goes. Get clear before it does. I'm warning you now so I don't have to warn you later, when warning will fail." Jon nodded, as if this were a simple lesson in the smithy, and set his men where they needed to be. "Take the wet blankets," he told 𝒉𝒆 and kegs. "Keep them soaked. You hear me? Soaked. When the splinters come through, we throw and we stamp. No heroics. We fight like cowards today and live." They heard the mammoth before they saw it, which is not something you usually say about a woolly beast the size of a barn. The tunnel took the footfall and made it into a heartbeat that knocked the dust loose from the chinks overhead, fine powder trembling in the lamplight as if the air itself were shivering. Then the first timbers cracked inward along the outer gate, and in the thin strip where the iron kiss met the wood there was suddenly sky, a wedge of white that made the entire tunnel seem like a throat about to swallow. "Masks," Noy said. "Cloth over nose and mouth. The smoke'll try to blind you. Don't let it." The next blow dragged a huge groan out of the wood, as if it were a dying man. Another, an iron shrieked, a hinge tearing, a bolt giving way. The inner gate's crossbar jumped in its sockets like a fish on a line. Jon could smell hair, hot hair, and the deeper stink that comes of wet beast and fear. "Ready," he said, and the boys looked at him and tried to hold their hands still. When they could not, they curled them around something stiff and square, the haft of a spear, the shaft of a halberd, and in time a grip is steadier because it is something you can command in yourself. The outer gate burst and the world tipped into the tunnel. Smoke and light and a wall of heat and men shouting in a tongue that had not been spoken on this side for 1,000 years. Through it all lumbered the huge brown mass of the mammoth, hair matted with ice, eyes rolling. Behind, men braced shoulder to tusk, shoving, a forest of legs and arms in a space that was meant for wagon wheels and not for this. Jon thought of Bran for one odd heartbeat, of small hands on the railing at a tower's top, and then that thought was gone with the rest, buried under the thing that fills you like winter fills a lung when you have to plunge into it. He stepped forward with long claw, felt the wolf on the pommel cold through the glove, and said, "Hold!" They held. The gate held too for a while. It smoked and creaked and sang the little song of iron under strain. Then it bulged, like a belly filled too fast, then cracked and leapt in a splintered yawp that made every man shout without meaning to. The bar bowed with a sound like a groan God might make. The mammoth shoved and the world shoved back. For a time, they were equal. Then something changed, the angle, perhaps, or the willingness of the men behind their beast to spend it, and the inner gate came in as if swallowed. "Throw," Jon said, and the wet blankets went, slapping onto the heat with a hiss that turned the tunnel's noises thin. Men leapt to their stamping, and for a little the fire abated. A then tried to climb across and got a spear through his thigh. Another reached to pull him back and caught a hammer to his hand from Donal Noy that made the wall meat of his palm slew like fat in a pan. Mag the Mighty came then, because no man takes his king name for mockery when it counts. He came like a door with feet, his shoulders filling the world, and he put his weight where men had been and made their shouting seem small. He ducked his massive head, tusk slivers and bone ornaments clacking, and came into the tunnel. Donal Noy looked at him as a smith looks at a flawed blade, without hatred, only with measuring. "You," Noy said, and raised his hammer. They fought like the last two pieces of a story that has been told too often. Steady, clumsy, brave. Jon killed a man and then another, not because he hated them but because they were in the way of the thing he had decided would not happen. He saw kegs go down and get up again, coughing, his face blackened. He saw 𝒉𝒆 sobbing and still pushing, and wondered at men, as you must if you see them clear and think at once. Then Donal roared as a man roars once in his life, when what he is meets what he has always been meant to do, and Mag the Mighty fell like a felled tree in the tunnel, his great body making the ground thump under Jon's boots. Noy sagged with him, his hammer falling from his hand. "Hold," Jon said again, hoarse now, the word little and ordinary and the most sacred thing he had. "Hold." Above, the rope lines hummed with men scrambling and men dropping. Robb's archers did not loose so evenly anymore. They had got to the hard part where you must remake your arms with your will every fifth shot. His voice was blood raw from shouting, but a voice is a blade in its way, and he cut with it. "Here, you two, over to that ladder. You poor now, no, wait. There now, pull the rope. Cut that one. Down, down, you idiots, you'll get the oil on you." Until the time came when shouting was a waste. Then he simply took up a bow and shot, because sometimes a king must be a man, and there is no better use for a man than doing what is in his hands when breath is too dear to spend on ordering. Once he saw a white-fletched arrow go by and strike a manderly boy in the throat. The boy put his hand up as if he had been lightly tapped there, a curious, almost affronted look, and then sat down suddenly with his back against the parapet stones and went still. Robb followed the line of flight as if it were a string he could pull on and saw her for an instant, standing calm on a snow hump with a bow in her hand, watching the wall the way men watch for weather. He drew and loosed and did not think of where the arrow would land, because the boy was dead, nothing would change that, and you waste a life twice if you let the second waste make you miss your next shot. Beneath, Ghost took a then by the calf and shook him once, hard, a clean killing, while gray wind went skittering along the base of the wall, teeth bared, making men see him out of the corners of their eyes at the worst possible moment. Robb had learned long ago that wolves accomplish more in a fight by making men look where they should not than by tearing. He did not envy the wildlings their fight on the rungs. Evening went ugly and then night came full. Torches made fat, wavering spears of light the color of honey thrown against the ice. Men's shadows flickered huge on the wall's face, giants pacing. Their limbs stretched long and slow, which was not how battle moved but was true in another way. Somewhere midnight came and went. The horns up top blew twice and then 3 times and then not at all, because no one had breath left for tooting. Then, at last, the grapnels ceased to bite. You can tell when the moment breaks, though it seldom does so cleanly. The wildlings withdrew like tide, foaming, leaving men behind stranded on ropes they could not climb a second time, on ladders smoldering near the top, on the snow where black shapes lay still and snow already reached to their knees. At dawn, Jon came up on the wall with his hair stiff with frozen blood and his face white beneath the dirt and the soot and the frost. "Noy," he said when he saw Robb, and that was all. Robb bowed his head, though he had not known Donal Noy but as a smith in Winterfell and a voice that had come to mean so much on this wall. "The gate holds," Jon said. For now. They stood together and watched the morning find the wildling camp to the north. The tree line smoked as if giants were cooking breakfast there. Then in the saddle between two long blotches of wood, tiny at that distance and dark against the pale world, men on horseback came like a script shifting the page. There were banners. They were too far to read, but Robb knew the handwriting of certain men by the shape of the letters they made in the air. "Stannis," Jon said. He did not spit or smile. "Stannis," Robb echoed. He tightened his glove. "If we die today, we will not be bored." "You know him?" Jon asked. "Only by what father told me and the letters I've read," Robb said. "He keeps a tight hand and an unhumored mouth. He believes in duty and in being the man he says he is, and if the world contradicts him, he shakes his head and says the world must be wrong." He let out a long breath. "There are worse sorts of kings." The trumpet calls drifted thin up the ice, shredded by wind and distance. The wildling camp moved, a quickening like wind through grass. From behind the trees the cavalry broke, trotting in order and then spurring to a charge that the snow tried to swallow and failed. 𝒉𝒆 had not expected a Southron army to appear from the north. Few men living would have. He had placed his heavy spearmen at the treeline to face what would surely come from the south. He had his giants and mammoths there, where they could break the tunnel again if the nightmen dared it. He had left his flank, a thing wildlings do know. 𝒕𝒔, a shape of battle they do not think in, half open to the east, where the ground sloped gently into a marshy patch that any man with a horse would avoid. Stannis avoided nothing where victory lay. He rode that flank, and his lesser men rode with him, and his better men led, knights of the Queen's Guard Ironhard even after their king had made a new queen of fire. It was not a glorious charge. It was a workmanlike slaughter. It was merciless. Robb saw it and tasted something bitter that was not exactly admiration and not exactly contempt. Then he saw a knot of men break away from the slaughter as if something in them had recalled that they were men and not a pageant of killing. The knot moved quick, clever, toward the king's banners among the tents. "𝒉𝒆," Jon said, as if the name were a mark on a board that a player could remove if he wanted. "He's no fool." "No," Robb said, "but neither is that one." He nodded to where a short, broad-shouldered man in a ragged cloak and a breastplate held too many times restrapped rode like a stake driven into earth where horses break against it. Others rallied on him. They made a circle and then a wedge and then they made a rout of the knot. "Davos," Robb said. "It must be." "You know him?" Jon asked again. "No," Robb said. "I only know the way men like that look when they do what they were made to do." By noon, the wildlings broke and ran where they could, dropped their spears where they could not, and stood with their hands out where they had no other choices left. Stannis set men to bind them and men to tally them and men to strip the dead. He did not waste speed on celebration. He rode to the wall under a banner like black sky cut by a red stag that looked as if it had run out of the center of the sun. He rode hard until he saw the gate, then slowed until his horse's breath stopped screaming and only whickered, and then he sat his horse and looked up and made the top of the wall feel like a tower in a boy's toy keep after all. He did not call for Robb or for Jon. He waited until they came down, which they did because you do not make a king shout up through a tunnel when you can keep him from it. Robb took off his crown and tucked it into his cloak before they went, and Jon saw and nodded and said nothing. Stannis had a face carved into lines that were not lines so much as the memory of lines left by habits he had long ago carved into himself. He was not grand, not gilded. He was iron and salt. Melisandre stood at his shoulder, a great red shadow that made fire seem a beast near enough to pet. Davos was there too, and his eyes were the sort of calm a man wears when he has argued himself into a quiet that might be wisdom and might be simply exhaustion. "My lords," Stannis said. His gaze went to Jon first, as if the wall had spoken to him and told him which man was the door here. "I found you not sleeping. We had guests," Jon said. He sounded tired, which was right, and young, which was true, and in no wise deferential beyond necessity, which was wise. "Thank you for timing your arrival to keep our door from splintering." Stannis accepted that with a short nod. "You are Stark," he said then, turning to Robb. and in his voice there was something like regret buried so deep you could only see it if you knew the ground well. "Not the one I would have preferred to speak to. The dead take their due and the living pay their debt. I am Robb Stark," Robb said, "King in the North." Stannis' mouth tightened. He did not argue. "You will lay that title down when the dead take notice and remember how to count," he said. "But if you are hard-handed and stiff-necked, at least you prefer the correct enemy." "We both do," Robb said. "Today." "Today," Stannis agreed. "I bring order with me, Lord Snow. The Night's Watch calls. I answer. The wildlings have broken law. They will keep it now. I will set my men along the wall. Eastwatch will feed my fleet, and my fleet will keep the narrow sea honest. And my honest sea will keep the south forgetful enough to let me do what must be done here." He turned his head, just slightly, toward Jon. "I am told you can be made Lord of Winterfell with a stroke of a quill if your brother asks politely." Melisandre's eyes shone like lamps behind faces, and Robb felt the words inside him flare and then settle like coals being shaken in a brazier to catch breath. "I asked," Robb said, his tone level. Jon refused. Stannis' gaze returned to Jon and weighed him like a merchant in a lean year. "You refused honor," he said, incredulous but not surprised, as if fate played a familiar joke again and again in front of him. "You are your father's boy to the last inch. That is to say, stubborn past use." "I have a vow," Jon said. "If the wall falls, there are no lords of anything worth being. It would be a fool's honor." Melisandre's head tilted. She looked at Jon as if she were looking into a brazier and seeing figures in the embers. "There is king's blood in him," she said, soft as a knife. "I smell it when he breathes." Robb's hand tightened on Grey Wind's ruff where he had said it without thinking, and the wolf's ears came forward, not at the words but at the tone. Jon did not step back. "You smell smoke," he said. "There's been fire enough." Stannis flicked a glance at his priestess and then dismissed the comment without visible effort. "The wall needs a man who can count, and a man who can fight, and a man who can deny his own wanting if that is what the world demands. It seems I have found one man who is 3 men. He looked to Robb again. "And another who is a boy in a crown and a soldier's heart. I will make use of both." "You will ask," Robb corrected him. "And I will answer, if the asking honors what the North is and what the Watch is, and the answer does not put my men in the ground to buy your banners one more day at court." Stannis' nostrils flared, just slightly. "You speak like your father." "I try," Robb said. He drew breath, a simple act that felt as if it required permission, and let it out. "We will set a truce between us, you and I, for as long as the dead keep walking in stories that will not stay stories. You will not ask men of the Watch to bend knee to you. You will not ask me to bend my knee until the spring thaw shows us how many knees are left to bend." "You would bargain with a king," Melisandre murmured. "In winter." "In winter most of all," Robb said. "That is when the bargains count." Stannis' mouth did something that might one day, if the gods were kind and he forgot himself, become a smile. "Davos," he said without taking his eyes from Robb's. "Write the words of it. Keep them small. The world will not make room for many." They spoke long and low by the wall while men tramped to and fro with tidy purpose, and wildlings stood in knots with their hands bound and their delicate hates burning holes in the cold. In the end, they had their simple piece of law. Stannis would supply thing and ship. The Watch would hold its own law. Robb would give men to the wall when asked and take nothing from it in return but what any honest neighbor may take: warning, warmth, aid when the roof leaks. There was no talk of kneeling. They both remembered it without speaking. They would remember it later also. That is how you keep some things from breaking. Robb went to the pyres when they set them off. Donal Noy's body burned with the giants, and the men did not love that, not at first. Then they watched the flame eat different flesh in the same hungry way and learned another ugly honest thing, and afterward there was less grumbling. Jon stood with his arms folded tight against himself and watched without blinking as long as the flames held shape. When they collapsed, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if blowing out a candle in his own head. "Eat," Robb said when they turned away. "Your hands are shaking." "They always do after," Jon said. "It's when they stop I'll worry." "You sound like father," Robb said. "I try," Jon answered, and that made them both smile the way a man smiles when he hears his own name in a stranger's mouth. Surprised and a little honored and a little afraid. They ate badly and slept worse. In the morning, Stannis sent for Jon. He did not send for Robb this time, which was politeness in its way. He wanted the wall, not the north, for this talk. Jon went, and Robb watched him go without getting to say any of the things you always think of when the back of the man you love is walking away from you toward a door. Catelyn came to stand beside him very quietly. She linked her arm in his like she used to when he was a boy, and she wanted him to know he must look at a guest with a smile no matter how much he wanted to be in the yard with a wooden sword instead. "He will refuse," she said after a time. "He will," Robb said. "It is the right refusing," she said. "It is," Robb said. He helped settle Mance Rayder's fate that afternoon. Stannis wanted the simple end. Davos watched the way a man watches when he expects a simple end to turn out not simple at all. Melisandre's eyes were bright as she spoke of smoke and needed signs and the way fire strips away lies. Robb stood and said, "No, not that. You will not burn what the wall must stand near. You will not teach the wildlings that our justice is a pyre. We have enough grief and too few winters left in our souls to feed it more. Take his head as a king. Take it clean." Stannis stared at him with something like anger and something like respect strangled under it. "You say no easily," he said. "I have practice," Robb said. "In the end, it was a sword and a block and the old breath that comes out of men's mouths when death passes that close and does not take them for company. Stannis did the deed because he was a king and because he does not give his burdens to other men if he can help it." Mance died with his mouth twisted in rueful humor, as if he had lost a bet with himself and was not surprised to find that he had. Jon watched and did not weep because he had made his tears expensive. Tormund Giantsbane shouted something that might have been a curse and might have been a prayer and afterward laughed in a way that made men's hackles lift. The wildlings watched and learned the lesson as it lay. Some of them stitched it to their skin. Some let it pass through. Robb went north the next day, not because he wanted to but because a king who eats his stores must replace them, and a wall that swallows a realm's breath will keep swallowing unless you feed it from bigger lungs. He left Bolton and a strip of men whose names he would remember with the watch, men whose loyalties cut across like woven reed. A Stark's name to hold them straight, a Lord Commander's word to hold them fast. He left men from each northern house who had come to him first because a piece of the sort they had written needs witnesses and hands in more than one pocket to sit steady. "Send me what you can," Jon said to him quietly at the yard's edge, where Ghost and Grey Wind pressed their flanks together as if they meant to knit themselves into one beast with twice the teeth. "Grain if you can find it, men if you can spare them, laughter if the gods allow it." "I'll send you meat and men," Robb said. "Laughter that I can't be sure of. We'll teach them to laugh less well in winter and call it a victory." "It is," Jon said. They did not embrace. They put their foreheads together for a breath only, the way boys do when they have no words yet for the size of what they feel and the weight of it makes their necks bow. Then Robb stepped back and went. The road that had brought him north would take him south again, and it seemed a different road entirely, lined with men who had stood on ice and seen men burn on it and learned a lesson from that they could not quite frame. Stannis sent men west under the Knight of Florence command to take Deepwood Motte and make the Iron Men there remember that their god drowns but cannot swim. He sent east to Eastwatch to summon Cotter Pike, whom the sea had made into a new sort of king with manners rougher than barnacles. He kept Melisandre at his shoulder because he had given her that place and because even stubborn men sometimes need to be warmed, and fire warms no matter what altars you built the night before. Jon watched it and did not let it shuffle his feet off the path he had chosen. He watched Sam pore over letters by the thick light of tallow candles and push bread on Gilly, and then push the bread aside himself and reach for the ink because he had found what he had been looking for, and the finding makes hunger a small thing for a short time. He watched Bowen Marsh keep tallies with the fury of a careful man set loose on a problem he could solve with a tally for once. He watched men chip ice from armorers' stones with hammers because there was no better use for a morning. It was a little time after they put Mance into ground the fire, had already taken that the mutineers made themselves known from Craster's pigsty of a hall. The raven's letter brought the smell of the place with it, though there was no scent on the paper, only the shape of the words that told of men gone soft from fear getting mean about it and killing a man who'd taken them in and fed them bad meat and worse looks because bad men provoke murder and good ones cannot always bear it. "We'll go," Jon said. He did not ask Stannis. He told him, and Stannis nodded as if a tool had been laid down where he wanted it a heartbeat before he called for it. "I'll take men who can be quiet longer than they can be brave. Take the small boy with the big heart," Davos advised in his low voice a little apart, as if making small notes for a ledger no one else would ever read. "He'll run if asked, and he'll not be too proud to do it fast." They took men and went. The air had that brittle cold that cracks things if you breathe wrong. The forest was a secret kept by trees. Jon slipped back into the way of moving within it he had learned with Corran and with men who called themselves free without laughter. He wore his sword and he wore his sadness, and he kept both sheathed until they had more use than harm. Craster's hall was a black mouth in a white face by the time they reached it. Smoke and ash and a stink of small gods long neglected and one big god that had never been asked to be kind. The mutineers were smaller than their sins. Thin men with bad teeth and eyes that twitched the way a rat twitches when the cat's shadow passes, and they died smaller than their noise. Jon found the child in the snow behind the hall where some fool had tucked him, as if the cold would hide the guilt from whatever gods were looking. He lifted him and handed him to one of the women with a gentleness that made the woman put her hand to her mouth, as if something had broken there that she had not known was brittle. "Burn it," Jon said as he looked at the hall. "Down to the last splinter. No more bargains here." They set the fire and watched it. Fire at the edge of the haunted forest looks different. It looks not like warmth but like a line drawn and dared. Jon stayed until the smoke stung his eyes and then stayed beyond that. When they turned back toward the wall, the sun was low and the snow began to fall sideways. Men pulled up their hoods and set their shoulders and made themselves into shapes the weather could not persuade. Back at the wall, the world turned to the business of choosing a Lord Commander because after a battle and a king's visit and 2 funerals, the Watch remembered that it was a house with a missing roof beam and roofs collapse unless someone with a title stands under the hole and pretends his shoulders are broader than they are. The talk was foolish a while, the way talk always is when men try to decide among themselves which of them to obey for the privilege of not having to decide quite so often thereafter. Cotter Pike grumbled and spat and had respect from men who sail and contempt from men who think sailing is just not drowning loud enough. Dennis Mallister lifted his fine old chin and spoke of honor in the sort of even tones softwood makes when you knock on it and the cabin has not yet heard a storm. Janos Slint wore his fear like a black cloak and pretended it was authority. Robb's name never entered the hall for that talk because the Watch kept its law even when kings were near. Robb's men were careful with their eyes and their tongues. They knew better than to widen their shoulders and loom. The choosing belonged to the old bear's ragged flock, and if some of those sheep had teeth and a few had horns, they were still sheep enough to know when a shepherd must be found among them. Sam did it in the end, with kindness and cunning so delicate it could be mistaken for cowardice by men too blunt to see the edge on a soft word. He made Pip laugh where he would not have. He made Bowen Marsh blush where he thought he could not. He made Mallister and Pike see that neither could be lord unless they wanted Janos Slint for supper, and both detested the taste of him. He tugged threads none of them knew they were wearing and tied them into a knot and set Jon's name in the middle. When they came to tell Jon he had been chosen, he looked first toward the gate, as if he could duck through it and make himself too small to cast a shadow a title could find. Then he set his hand on Longclaw's pommel, not to grasp it, only to feel its cold again, and bowed his head and said the words a man says when men load him with a burden that will not slide off. He accepted. Robb stood at the back and watched the men he had eaten beside and bled across the same stone with shout Jon Snow's name until it became not a name but a sort of prayer and a sort of promise that they did not know they were making. It hurt in the best way. Catelyn stood beside him, very still, and did not speak until the hubbub made a peak and rolled down into laughter like water going down a stepped weir. "I was not kind to him," she said again, not new, but this time with no edge of defense around it at all. "The gods forgive such things slower than we do." Robb did not answer. Some truths sit along the bones and need no words to be held in place. When he took his leave to ride south once more, the wall was different. It looked the same. It always would. But there is a way a house feels when the head of it has declared himself in a place where men could hear and be relieved they need not carry quite so much. Jon moved through the yard now with men stepping aside not out of fear but out of that relief. He stood a little straighter. He ate with more appetite and spoke less in his cups. He seemed older. He was not. He never would be, not really, no matter what white streaks the wind put in his hair. But he would act like it, and sometimes that is enough to fool the world. Sometimes it fools the man himself long enough to become true. "Hard home," Jon said one evening, speaking the word like a piece of old bone found under a hearthstone. "The wildlings talk of it. Fire gone cold there. People starving under cliffs. If there is anything to that, we should bring them in. Doors open to enemies in winter if you don't want to find them frozen at your threshold. We have boats. We have men who can sail them. Cotter Pike curses like 3 men, but he'll curse at the oars until the skin comes off his hands and doesn't notice. We'll need food, and fire, and luck. Luck we do not keep much of," Robb said. "But I can spare men and wood and iron that doesn't splinter when you give it a name." "Send me a few manderly ships," Jon said, looking down at the map and not up into Robb's face. "White Harbor's men know the chivalry. See when it behaves and when it pretends to. I'll trade Pike for one Lord Manderly's fat son if the gods offer." "They will not," Robb said, thinking of Wyman's jowls and the sharp cunning that hid somewhere behind those folds. "You may have a White Harbor coxswain and 2 pilots that won't capsize their own boats despite a storm. You may not have any Manderly heir. I need those to seat at my table and weigh things down so they don't blow off." "Done," Jon said simply, and just for a heartbeat he looked up with that boy grin that had once got him into trouble more times than Robb could count. "You sound like a king. And you like a lord," Robb said. They parted the next morning under a sky like hammered lead. The wind came slantwise off the ice fields and cut. Catelyn wrapped her cloak twice, then unwrapped it because the weight felt like a hand on the back that might push when she needed to brace. "Bring me letters," she told Jon, and then shook her head. "No. Bring me yourself when you can. Words are small bread." "I will bring you both, my lady," Jon said, and Catelyn took the my lady with no flinch at all now, only a kind of rue that made her mouth look young for a blink. "If I cannot bring myself, I will send you lying words that say I am well until I can make them true." "Do that," she said. "Mothers prefer lies that promise the truth to the truth that promises nothing." They rode. The north opened to them as it always had, stubbornly. The snow thinned and deepened by turns. The air had tastes in it that meant more to wolves than men. Gray wind loped happy, tongue out, a lord in his house. Robb kept thinking of the wall and of Jon on it, and every time his thoughts went that way, the road under him seemed narrower and steadier. Back at the wall, the night drew long and sharp again. The dead came as Jon had known they would. They did not come loud. That is not their way. They came as spoon scrape on a kettle at midnight when all the meat is eaten, as the sound a fur makes when a hand against it moves the wrong way. The sentry on the western tower, a man named Pate with a neck like a sapling and a wife in Molestown who had sunk into the earth with the rest, saw a figure moving slowly across the new-fallen snow and called and got no answer. He called again and then called once more, and then his friend Hobbart came up from the stair muttering about the cold in his bones, and then both stopped speaking together because the figures moving in the snow did not sink, though the snow was deep, and did not lay down breath on the air, though the air took every breath and made it show like a string drawn in front of a fire. "Wake the Lord Commander," Pate managed, and Hobbart did not say nonsense, not this time. He went, and the bell went, and men went, stumbling, grabbing sword belts and slopping boots. Jon was on the parapet quickly, Longclaw in his hand as if he had been holding it in his sleep. Melisandre came like a flame walking, her red cloak pulled tight, eyes already bright, as if she had been waiting for this in the back of her gaze since she was born. Stannis came slower because kings pretend not to hurry even when the world needs them to, and Davos came faster because he had learned to run when men cried out. "What do you see?" Stannis demanded. He spoke as if he meant to bite the wind. "Trouble," Jon said. "Not so many I'd call it doom." Not so few I'd call it a jaunt. He did not wait for leave. He gathered men he trusted to do the thing required without asking for the names of the dead they would make. He set them along the wall walk, every second man with a torch in hand, every first with an oil pot. He had archers lay arrows by, points dipped in pitch for quick flame. He told Melisandre, "Stand here." And she did, because she wanted to see and because Jon Snow gave no man or woman too much ceremony in a storm. The figures came on and did not make any noise men could name. When they were near enough for eyes to be eyes and hands to be hands and mouths to be mouths, the mouths were wrong. Blue light lay in their faces where warmth had no business. The first wights climbed as men climb. The others did not climb. They came into the night like parts of the night deciding to stand up and swing a blade. Jon felt them before he saw them, the way you feel a weather change in your teeth if you have broken one as a child and the scar never forgets pain. "Now," he said, and the torches went down on ropes and the first rank of wights caught fire and took the fire to the feet behind them. They did not scream. They simply went down and burned, and their fellows stepped over them and into the burning because the will that drove them cared nothing for the way heat takes flesh and makes it weep. Another came out from the shadow of the nearest rock and lifted something in its hand that might have been a sword if ice ever grew bored enough to want to kill men. The blade sang when it moved. Jon felt the sound along his bones, the way you feel a truth you have refused to look at. He moved to meet it without telling his feet to do so. It came up the face of the wall as if the ice were a stair built for it. Men fell back without meaning to, as if the air around it were pushing them. Melisandre made a low sound in her throat that might have been a word in a language older than the red god she called holy. The other moved lightly, a dancer on a cold stage. Jon went down on one knee to meet its cut, because a man from the yard does not give up proper form even when he fights a story made flesh. The swords met with a sound like a hiss made of glass. Longclaw's Valyrian steel did not shatter. It screamed. Sparks inched off it like insects flung into a candle. Jon's wrist bucked with the force of the strike, and he used that buck to make a circle and come round and carve at the pale thing's side. It moved as if it had seen him make that choice before he thought of it. Its blade licked at his cheek, and the cold there was absolute. It burned the way winter burns if you stand naked in it for too long, slow and bone deep. "Fire?" he said, calm, though his heart had stuttered once in his chest and wanted to keep stuttering. The men did their work. Pitch fell. The other twisted, a shape that did not have to remember to be graceful. And when the pitch found its arm, the cold where it passed made the flame gutter. Jon saw that and did not make the mistake of men who think a thing cannot be done because it failed when tried once. He took the blow on his shoulder and felt the leather part and something in him complain and then go quiet. He set his foot and drove Longclaw in a shallow rising cut from hip to opposite shoulder, as if he were taking a man's belt and head in one neat line. This time, the other did not move quick enough. The blade went through with a chalk crack, and for a breath Jon held in his hand a sword driven through a shape that was part night and part winter and part the bone he had felt in his mouth since he was a boy. The blue light folded, very neatly, like a long piece of silk being set away on a shelf. The bits of what had been a man, frost, snow, something very like old glass, went sideways in a scatter that made the men on either side take a little step to avoid being touched by it. Jon drew breath and found it hard work. He turned his head and saw another of them standing 3 spear lengths away, the faint suggestion of a smile on a face that had never laughed. Melisandre lifted her hands, scarlet sleeves falling back, and flame leapt high from torches that had not burned that hot a heartbeat before. "Back?" Jon said to the men beside him, and they obeyed him because they had lived this long by obeying him when his voice took that tone. The other cocked its head, not in fear, not in caution, only as a man cocks his head at a bird that sings an unexpected note. Then it stepped backward into the night and was the night again. They burned the wights where they clumped at the base of the wall all day, adding oil until the snow near the wall turned to a black slush that froze, then thawed, then froze again, a treacherous skin. Men went down in it and cursed and were hauled out by friends with curse words of their own. By evening, the field was clear of motion and full of shapes that would not move again. Jon stood with his cheek wrapped in a strip of clean linen that would turn gray by morning. Stannis stood beside him and did not tell him well done or any such nonsense. "You will need more," he said instead, which was the only compliment that mattered. "Dragonstone has obsidian in its bones. I'll have men pry it out. Blades, arrowheads, what else?" "Spears," Jon said. "Short for fighting in a place like a tunnel. Long for holding a line where the snow will not take your feet out from under you. Tell your men to chip carefully. If they chip poorly, the heads break on second use or first, and sometimes that first is in a man's thigh rather than a dead thing's belly. I will send men who know hard work," Stannis said, "and I will expect to find you living to name what they did wrong in spring. Send flour too," Jon said, and Stannis actually did smile then, sharply, like a crack running through old paint. Men expect magic knives to solve hunger. They never do. When Robb's men came from the south with grain on rough sleds and meat sweating its fat into salted cloth and bundles of arrows and 3 small kegs stamped with the green onion of White Harbor, Jon felt something ease at last in his ribs. He counted it in the ledger that would be his life now, a little less tightness, a little more breath, a chance to send men in boats east to Hardhome sooner rather than late. He sent Cotter Pike with men who could row until their hands bled and then row more, and a White Harbor pilot called Theld because none of the men around him could be bothered with the last 2 syllables of his too long name. He asked for volunteers, and he did not look surprised when men least likely to live through it stepped forward first. He asked for 2 wildlings to go with them because men who never stood on a boat should not be the ones shouting at other men who fear water. Tormund offered himself, and Jon said no because leaders who do that too often teach men the wrong lesson. "Bring me as many as you can," he told Cotter on the ladder down to the river's little dock. "We none of us know what number means success here. Let's pretend 100 and be pleased with anything near that." Cotter spat into the water because sailors are obliged to appease whatever god lives there, even this far from tide. "I'll bring you 200, he said, and when Jon did not smile he added, "Or I'll bring you none and never trouble your numbers again." "You're not allowed die," Jon said. "No one is allowed to die. I wrote it in a book." Cotter actually laughed at that, a single bark, and pushed off. The little boats looked wrong under the wall. Frogs' eggs drifted at the foot of a cliff, but they went, and men watched until they were small as mites and then could not be seen at all. And the watching did no good to any man's heart but kept his hands out of mischief for a while. Stannis left for Deepwood, moving like a piece on a board slid just so that the other player cannot take it without throwing 3 more pieces into danger. Melisandre watched him go with that private fire on her face. Davos watched Jon. "He'll ask again," Davos said, with his mouth half curled as if the words tasted of brine. "About Winterfell." "He will," Jon agreed. "And you'll tell him no again," Davos said. "I will," Jon said, "until I can't. And if that time comes, I'll know it the way a man knows when he's warming his hands over a brazier that's about to go out." "You speak sense for one so young," Davos said. "Your father, if fathers are what we call men in our mind when we need their ghost. He left a fine blade in you. Keep it clean." The ravens came and went, black commas in a white sky full of sentences men had not yet learned to parse. Letters from the south came weighted with seal wax and claims and exclamations that insisted on being important. Robb sent fewer words and better ones, the way a man eats in winter when he is careful. He wrote of lords and ladyships and weather patterns and how much grain could be coaxed out of men without breaking their backs and their spirits both. He wrote of a child born in a snowstorm whose father named him Donal with a hard look on his face that said no one would laugh near that name on his land. He wrote of a fry rider sent home with his nose reset straight and his mouth full of pretty promises, which are in the north a kind of insult that graceless men mistake for gifts. He wrote of Howland Reed coming and going like fog and leaving behind a little packet of obsidian teeth wrapped in a strip of faded silk that smelled of musk and pond water. Jon kept the letters in a safe oiled leather case much kissed by weather. He took them out when the night pressed too close and read 1 or 2 and found in the words a fire he could bank again when he folded the paper. He did not read them all at once because rationing is a habit that saves your life, and it does not matter whether you ration saltfish or sentences written in a careful hand at a rough table 100 leagues away. Spring for a day came and went, the snow softening on top and crusting at night, treacherous as a liar who smiles as he speaks. Men's tempers did the same. Fists were used where words might have done. Jon broke 2 fights with few words and a very light touch, and broke one with Longclaw's flat and a harder hand for men who thought his patience meant he was made of patience through and through. After, he sat on a bench with his head in his hands until Ghost pushed his big head under Jon's wrist and lifted it. A ridiculous act for a direwolf, and Jon laughed once and felt human again. The boats from Hardhome returned thin and ragged and with more souls in them than wood. And Cotter Pike stepped off looking as if he had been caught by the sea, chewed, and spit at last with bad temper for taste. "How many?" Jon asked, and Cotter stared at him for a heartbeat, as if he were a man dragged from a wreck and hearing that his wife had burned the bread. "Too many," he said. "Not enough. 1,500 and the bones of 2,000 more to gnaw on in my dreams. The cliffs there are wrong. The air is wrong. The people there already smell of wrong, and I don't say that because they live on fish and speak like the sea taught them their letters. There are things moving in the caves and on the shore that do not move right for animals nor men, and I'm a man who's seen gulls walk and oysters cough. Let us not go back, Lord Commander. Or if we must, let's go back with fire big enough to cook the sodding cape off that place. Eat," Jon said, "then sleep lying down like a man. Then tell me twice more the same and we'll set it to law." In the weeks that followed, the others came near and then fell away as if testing. Perhaps they did not think in testing terms at all. Perhaps they merely moved as winter moves, with confidence that hills will be hills and roads will drag men where cold wants them to go. Once, Jon dreamed of a blue flower opening in a crack in the ice and waking with tears in his eyes and no reason on his tongue to give for them. Melisandre came to him another night and said, "I saw you in the flames with a crown of shadows and a sword that burned blue in places where no fire should be. 3 heads for it and none your own." He told her she ought sleep more and watch flames less. He did not tell her that sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he heard a woman say a name in a room that smelled of blood and crushed petals, and that the name would not quite come. Stannis took Deepwood. The Ironborn learned to say his name without joking. Letters fluttered at the wall that said Roose Bolton had been eyed sideways by 3 different lords in one single hall, and had managed to accept a cup of wine from none of them without giving offense or poison a chance. Letters came that said the phrase had retreated wolf-bitten to their bridge, where their old man counted slight and slur with a precision that would have made a maester proud if it had been applied to books instead of blood. Letters came that said nothing at all but carried the rough rub of northern wool against their seals, and so told Jon as much as words might have about the state of the world below. One evening wind scoured the top of the wall clear, and stars came out in such numbers that even men who lived under such sky every night stopped and stared a while and let their breath make little ladders for their thoughts to climb. Jon stood with Ghost, and the cold went in as far as it could and then was stopped by something inside that would not yield to it. He thought of Robb somewhere below that same sky, his breath a cloud over a table where he measured out which roads must be broken to stop men from marching where they should not. He thought of his father and of Ned's quiet voice in the God's Wood at Winterfell saying a promise with a man's entire life wrapped around it. He thought of a boy at a block whose head had rolled into straw and of another boy who had refused a crown with a hand that shook and then steadied. "What if I told him?" he asked aloud, not to Ghost but to the old gods whose only reply is the sound of leaves in Winterfell and the creak of old ice here. "What if I told him all of it?" Ghost turned his head and pressed his jaw against Jon's knee, a heavy, affectionate weight. Jon laughed, and the laugh felt like a spark that did not go out in the wind. He said, "not yet, maybe never. Promises bind better than rope, and we're lashed enough." South, Robb read another of Jon's few letters and found there the line that mattered most to him. "I am the walls, and I am yours because I was yours before." Those truths do not contradict. They stand together like 2 men who have learned to back one another in a press. He folded the letter and set it where he set the others, and then he went to the fire and warmed his hands and did not think of crowns, because a man who thinks of his crown in winter is a man who will find himself wearing a crown of ice in spring, which is to say dead. He thought of bread and of spears and of how to teach men to laugh less loudly at a feast so that they could hear the warning when a man coughed wrong into his cup. He thought of Howland Reed somewhere waist-deep in water, stalking a truth the way a heron stalks fish. He thought of Catelyn sitting in a room at White Harbor with a boy on her lap who had been named for a smith and would one day throw stones at his brother and refuse to apologize. The world moved. Men stood. Snow came and went and came again. Wolves hunted. Ravens made their straight, black cuts across the gray. When the next storm rolled down off the shivering sea with a voice like torn silk, Jon set his men where they must be and went where he must go and did not think of himself as anything much at all. He was a piece of the wall, that was the truth. And beside that, unspoken and perhaps wholly for being unspoken, he was a boy from Winterfell whose brother had once chosen to be that word, brother, until the word became a bridge they both could walk upon when the ice got thin. If the gods are sensible, they take their miracles in small sips. Men should too. Jon and Robb did. They did not tell themselves this was victory. They did not tell themselves it was defeat. They told themselves, each in his place, that the sun would try to rise tomorrow and that their work would be to make sure there was something for it to shine on besides snow and bones. They slept and woke. The wind came and went. Letters flew. Knives were kept sharp. Children were fed. The dead in their long, slow hunger pressed their faces against the night and peered through it, unblinking. The living held and did not break. And far away, under hills older than anyone's vows, a boy with a crow in his dreams turned his face north and stepped forward, and the trees leaned to see, and the rest was a road none of them could yet name.